Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Siege of Vraks, where today we are going to be looking at the Renegade and Chaos reinforcements, who so recently arrived in system. But before that, I have a little announcement to make. I, you see, have merchandise to shill. I'm running a limited campaign with Tribefire, where I'm selling off a small number of mousepads with my own horrible-looking little signature on it. Don't criticize me too harshly, I type entirely via keyboard these days, so my handwriting is less than it once was. Anywho, I figured these would be interesting little collector's items for those of you who really like these videos and might want to have something a bit more personal than just a jersey or a polo, for example. So, if that sounds interesting, please do go ahead and have a look at them. The link will be at the top in the description below. Now, with the shilling out of the way, let's get started with the reinforcements that arrived on Vraks, because they were significant indeed, and in a rather shocking variety of ways as well. As we talked about in the last video, these reinforcements arrived from outside of Vraks, many of them from deep within the Eye of Terror itself, and after battling their way through the wholly inadequate Imperial Navy defense flotilla, they arrived above the planet of Vraks. One of the heavy transports, the Aron's Bane, was shot down and forced to carry out a relatively successful crash landing upon the planet's surface, something that was going to turn out to be rather important a bit later on. But the rest of the Chaos Flotilla and their reinforcements were allowed to arrive in stable orbit above Vraks almost wholly undisturbed, with only the mild exception of the Council Thracia, captained by Rear Admiral Mazur, who decided to attempt to ram the Anarchy's heart, which turned out rather poorly, both for the Rear Admiral and everyone else involved on the Imperial side of the conflict, as it left the remaining Imperial Navy elements in system badly understrengthed. Out of 3 defense monitors with which the Imperial Navy started the battle, only 1 battered monitor remained. Out of 6 sword-class frigates, only 2. And out of the 4 cruisers in system, 1 had been lost completely, another, the Lord Bellerophon, was little more than a floating wreck, and the Orion was badly bruised after its engagement with 2 Chaos cruisers, leaving the Imperial Navy with only 1 single intact cruiser, the Covenator, who had been ordered to break off from the attack attempt upon the Anarchy's heart. This left the Chaos Flotilla in a wonderful position above the planet of Vraks. They need not worry about any further interference, at least not immediately, for the Imperial Navy, and so could dedicate the entirety of their naval forces to aid, supply, and deploy the reinforcements they carried upon the planet of Vraks. And the first and probably most important and game-changing of these reserves were, of course, air power. As mentioned, up until this point, air power had played virtually no role in the Vraxian campaign whatsoever, but the entrance of Chaos forces, bolstered primarily by 2 types of void and air superiority crafts, were to change that quite drastically. The first and most numerous of these reinforcements were the Hellblade air and void superiority fighters. The Hellblade's primary role in Chaos armies is to act as an interceptor and local air superiority fighter in atmosphere. It is also capable of operating in the void, but its relatively light armament and armor makes it a less than ideal void superiority craft. However, the lacking weapons and armor of the craft are considered to be more than made up for by its increased maneuverability under gravity and atmospheric conditions, making it an excellent in-atmosphere fighter. The Hellblade's primary strength is its nippy nature and maneuverability, provided primarily by its vectored thrust jet engines and the somewhat unpredictable nature of its pilots. The Hellblade is considered a chaff-level fighter, deployed in vast quantities and operated primarily by hard-wired servitors. These former humans are wired directly into the craft's control surfaces and are pumped full of endorphins and other pleasurable drugs when they achieve an air-to-air kill. This means that these servitors live only for combat, only for killing, and whilst this makes them somewhat hard to control, it does make them supremely aggressive pilots, with all of the various benefits and detriments that such a temperament introduces. Experienced Imperial Navy pilots often find they're able to bait Hellblades into inopportune positions from which they can easily be taken out, but less experienced pilots can easily be overwhelmed by the sheer aggressive nature of the Hellblades and become easy targets for the Hellblade's quad-linked autocannons. But even experienced Imperial Navy pilots would do well to never relax fully around a Hellblade fighter, as they are not always operated by servitors, but also occasionally crewed by humans, usually Chaos cultists, and occasionally also far darker things. The servants of the Ruinous Powers have, on many an occasion, attempted to trap various demonic entities within machinery, and the Hellblade fighter is no exception. The other principal craft deployed by the Chaos Flotilla was the Hell Talon. This is a far heavier version of the Hellblade, retaining the same dagger-shaped wings but carrying a larger crew of 3, of which 1 is usually a standard human aided by 2 servitors, and carrying far more in the ways of armor and armaments. Whilst deployed in the Void, this is more of a proper Void superiority fighter. Although still considered on the light side of things for Void fighters, it is, by atmospheric terms, a heavy fighter, deployed primarily as a fighter-bomber when operating in gravity. As it possesses the same vectored thrust engines as the Hellblade, the Hell Talon is still rather maneuverable, but it weighs in at almost 6 times as much as the Hellblade. This means it's nowhere near as nippy as its smaller cousin, but in its favoured role as a fighter-bomber, its superior energy retention allows it to streak towards a planned surface at incredible speeds, and then zoom away before enemy air defences have a good chance of locking onto it and destroying it. In its favoured role as a ground attacker, the Hell Talon also carries a ferocious amount of firepower. It possesses a twin-linked las cannon, both for knocking out other aerial targets and for destroying heavily armoured vehicles, 1 autocannon for point defense and ground strafing, and up to 8 bombs, be it incendiary, fragmentary, or high explosives. The large crew of the Hell Talon also allows its various weapon packages to be operated simultaneously and targeted independently. The crew usually consisting of 1 human fulfilling the role of commander and 2 hardwired servitors, 1 operating as the craft's pilot and the other as its gunner. On occasion, a Hell Talon might be manned by a full crew of humans or a partial crew of humans, and occasionally the entire craft may be commanded by a demonic entity, fulfilling simultaneously the role of commander, gunner, and pilot. Experiments were also done to see if a demonic entity could fulfill 1 out of the 3 roles, but it turns out that demons very rarely play well with others. Luckily for the Death Corps of Krieg, these 2 types of aircraft were the only ones available in large enough quantities to be used constantly and effectively by the invading Chaos fleet. If they also had in their possession Helldrakes or Harbinger super heavy bombers, things would have gotten a hell of a lot dicier for the Death Corps. Not that things were looking particularly rosy even without them, mind you, since now the Chaos forces had access to what was essentially flying artillery, which could strike with great precision and very little in the way of warning any single point in the Death Corps lines. They could attack artillery batteries, forward bunkers, supply trains, airfields. Anything and everything in the Death Corps' possession was now a potential target. Luckily for the Death Corps, their paranoia had seen them bring along a decent amount of anti-aircraft guns, but nowhere near enough to cover everything. They would have to prioritize the most vital installations: ammo dumps, fuel bowsers, artillery batteries, whilst the poor bastards operating the logistics trucks or sitting in the front trenches would be forced to sit there with their asses flapping, exposed and lovely in the wind. And speaking of exposed butt cheeks, there is of course another problem that the introduction of Chaos air power introduced to the Death Corps of Krieg. Previously, the Death Corps was able to marshal its forces pretty much anywhere they wanted, and could carry out large-scale sweeping offensive operations pretty much at any time and in any place. The only thing they really had to worry about when carrying out large-scale maneuvers was enemy artillery, which could of course be suitably suppressed by Imperial artillery, which outnumbered the Vraksian guns by a fairly horrific margin, and if the Imperials really wanted to ensure that a sector was free of artillery harassment, they could always simply just move even more guns into that sector. With air power, however, that was considerably harder to take precautions against. Now, any large-scale maneuvers undertaken by the Death Corps might be constantly harassed by enemy air power. Suddenly, Krieg armored elements could only move if constantly shadowed by companies of anti-aircraft guns, and even then, they were far from safe. They were merely just a little bit safer, or at the very least in a position to make the enemy pay for the damage they inflicted. This, in effect, meant that the Death Corps' maneuverability had been severely hampered, whilst the maneuverability of their enemies had only increased. The constant threat of air attack meant that Death Corps artillery batteries now had to move between their various positions far more frequently, allowing the Vraksians and Renegades a great deal more in the way of leeway to move their forces without seeing them instantly obliterated by a blitzing rain of artillery fire. But even more significant was once again the Chaos Forces' newly acquired void superiority, because there was one further aircraft, quote-unquote, that was going to have a very significant effect upon the battle on the planet below, and that, of course, was the Dreadclaw Droppods. It certainly is stretching the definition of aircraft a bit, but the Dreadclaw Droppods were most definitively a facet of air power, and they allowed the Chaos Space Marines in orbit to strike at virtually any Death Corps position at any time and with overwhelming speed and ferocity, being able to deliver dozens of traitor Astartes directly into the heart of Death Corps formations with virtually nothing in the way of warning. And again, the Death Corps' lack of anti-aircraft artillery came to bite them once more. The Death Corps had just about enough in the way of anti-aircraft guns to ensure that it would be unadvisable for the Renegade Astartes to drop directly upon their improvised starports, or their main centers of command and control, but the rest of their lines were, once again, just as if the air attacks, left dangerously exposed. It is one thing to defend a position against air attack, at least then you have some sort of warning, and you have various forms of guidance to direct the anti-aircraft artillery against the fast-moving targets. But against drop pods, for which there is very little in the way of warning as they come down directly on top of the defences and move at such speed that aiming is essentially pointless, the only real defense is to put up such a mighty wall of flak that you're bound to hit something by sheer virtue of flooding the target area with shrapnel. And now that we've touched upon the subject of traitor Space Marines, let's have a little bit of a closer look into that, shall we? There were 11 different warbands engaged in the siege for Vraks. of which quite a few were identified. There were elements of several World Eater warbands, of which the Skulltakers, the Sanctified, and the Berserkers of Vraks were identified. There were also several warbands of Death Guard, the Lords of Decay, the Tainted, the Apostles of Contagion, and the Purge. There was also the single identified warband of Iron Warriors known as the Steel Brotherhood. The rest were a various assortment of smaller warbands, including of course Arcos's Alpha Legionnaires, and possibly also a Black Legion warband. The total number of these renegade Astartes is unknown. It may surprise you to hear, but Chaos warbands rarely adhere to much in the way of an organizational charter. But based upon previous engagements with the Alpha Legion and the number of ships involved, we can say for absolute certain that there were more than 100 Chaos Space Marines on Vraks, and possibly even as many as 1,000. If all of these traitor Marines had been under a unified command structure, the Death Corps of Krieg would have been well and truly buggered. But fortunately for the men of Krieg, Chaos warbands are rarely of the cooperative sort. In fact, somewhat ironically, the very nature of the enemy's reinforcements were also the very reason why the Death Corps wasn't simply annihilated outright by these new enemy forces, as they only initially focused their attentions upon the Death Corps, and then almost immediately began the far more important task of making sure that their own interests were being placed first. And of course, the Chaos Space Marines were not the only reinforcements. There were also renegade troops of a more regular type, and some further big beasties. But before we get to these, let's have a little bit more of a close-in look upon the Chaos Space Marine reinforcements, since they were going to have a disproportionate effect upon the coming campaign, starting with the World Eaters. Once upon a time, the World Eaters, just like the other Legiones Astartes, was a single organized entity under the command of their Primarch Angron. But due to the rather unfortunate temperament of their Primarch, their fall to Khorne was almost guaranteed the very moment he took control of the World Eaters Legion. After a lengthy and painful fall, the World Eaters Legion was eventually defeated along with the other traitors at the end of the Great Heresy. This heralded the beginning of a shattering of their once proud legion that had once been known as the Emperor's Warhounds. During a conflict with one of their fellow traitor legions, one of the legion's most prominent commanders after Angron went full batshit, Karn, also had some anger management issues all of his very own, and dedicated himself fully to chaos, roving around the battlefield killing friend and foe alike. After that bloody conflict, the Legion was shattered irreparably into thousands of smaller warbands, of which 3 had made their way to Vraks. The World Eaters of the modern Imperium are the favoured champions of Khorne, the Blood God, who cares not from whence the blood flows, as long as it flows. And they fight with an utter disregard for tactics, discipline, or any form of strategy. They are merely berserkers who throw themselves into the battle line with no greater goal than to unleash as much carnage as possible. And considering their superhuman physique and devastating weaponry favouring bolt pistols and chain axes, they are usually quite good at unleashing a great deal of carnage. And then of course we have the Death Guard, favoured sons of Mortarion and Nurgle, the Lord of Plague. Just like the World Eaters, they were once a loyal legion in the service of the Imperium and the Emperor of Mankind. But during the events of the Horus Heresy, they pledged themselves to Nurgle, the God of Plague and the Lord of Decay. They are now little more than rotting husks of bloated, putrid offal, who retain all of the strength and resilience of their former superhuman physiology, whilst boosting it yet further with a near complete and utter immunity to pain, suffering, and disease. They do not quite share their World-Eater brethren's disdain for tactics and strategy, but they still prefer to utilize their true and tested methods that they used all the way back during the Great Crusade. The Death Guard will launch their assault with a devastating initial bombardment, utilizing any and all weapons at their disposal, including chemical and biological means of warfare. After the enemy has been suitably devastated, the Death Guard's Plague Marines will simply march slowly and inexorably upon the enemy's front line, trusting in their rotted and putrid physique to absorb any and all devastation the enemy may unleash upon them. And with frightening frequency, their trust is well rewarded. To try and kill a Death Guard Plague Marine is like attempting to kill a swarm of flies. Only by utterly incinerating and destroying the entirety could you have any real hope of killing it. Ever gracious and loving of his followers, Grandfather Nurgle provided the Vraxian renegades with 4 full warbands of Death Guard. And then of course there's the Iron Warriors. Now, we did touch upon them briefly, but I think it bears repeating because despite the fact that there was only a single warband of Iron Warriors, they might be the most significant reinforcements that Vraks received, not only due to their expertise in siegecraft, but also because the Iron Warriors, unlike the frothing zealots of the World Eaters or the blind dogmatic followers of the Plague Gods, the Iron Warriors are professionals. They fight wars to win, and not for the mindless glory of some uncaring warp entity. And this trait makes them all the more dangerous. They are fully able to, and willing to utilize the Imperium's tactics against it. They will use massed barrages, they will use infiltration tactics, they will use shock tactics, and they will happily utilize the particular talents of their fellow traitors. They will gladly allow the World Eaters to wander out ahead, eating up the majority of the enemy's heavy weapons fire. They will happily allow the followers of the Plague Gods to weaken the enemy with barrages of corrosive acid poisons. They will happily allow the Lost and the Damned militia forces to wander out and get butchered in huge quantities just to figure out where the enemy's heavy guns are pointed. In other words, they will use the other followers of the ruinous gods like pieces on a chessboard to determine and execute the most effective plan of operations. Of course, in this particular case, the chess pieces will often directly counteract the efforts of the Iron Warriors and will do their absolute damnedest to fuck up any and all plans they come up with, but hey, we all have our little problems to deal with, don't we? But enough power armor for now. Let's get into the meat of the reinforcements, the real numbers, made up of what is often referred to as the Lost and the Damned. That, by the way, being a catch-all term for the huge variety of followers of the ruinous powers that make up the bulk of their armies. Everything from mutants to renegades to traitors, secessionists, cultists, and frequently even slaves, captured by the various warbands and then forced into the service of the Dark Gods. The Lost and the Damned are a remarkably diverse lot, whose only real unifying feature is that they all worship the ruinous powers in one way, shape, or form, or alternatively, that they have been forced into the worship of these warp-born deities. Their strategic value is often far more limited than their numbers. In the case of Vraks, a report suggests that something along the lines of 500,000 renegades were deployed to the planet below, but their real military value was probably somewhere well and truly south of that number. But again, you can never know if the lost and the damned. There are certain warlords on the fringes, for example, that have created their very own imitation Imperial Guard regiments that fight in a disciplined fashion, utilizing combined arms tactics and proper high-level strategies. There are no clear reports suggesting that any of these known formations were present on Vraks, but it serves to highlight the differences, since on the other side of the spectrum you have screaming hordes of maddened mutants and lunatics being thrown towards the enemy's lines with absolutely not a single solitary care for their lives, driven forward like so much chattel by their betters and their more valuable masters. Even the Death Corps, a formation known for its high casualty figures, would frown at such an often completely pointless waste of lives. At least when the Death Corps sends their men forwards to get slaughtered, there is some form of reason behind it, whilst the slaves of chaos are often sent into no man's land for no better reason than because their masters thought it would be amusing to watch them be torn apart. But, of course, do not make the mistake of thinking that the lost and the damned have absolutely no military value. Whilst in an open field battle they would never stand up to a proper Imperial Guard regiment, this is not an open field battle. This is a siege. And even undisciplined lost and the damned cultist, mutants, beastmen, fanatics, heretics, etc. can make for rather effective fodder when placed inside of reinforced bunkers and given heavy machine guns to operate. And on Vraks, this was just what the defenders needed. The less disciplined and controllable forces could be sent off to garrison duties, which would free up the far more veteran and disciplined Vraxian forces for more mobile and offensive tasks. And make no mistake, whilst the defenders of Vraks may have started out as PDF forces or Labour Auxilia, they had been fighting this war for years and years and years at this point. They were now as hardened a group of combat veterans as anyone else on this God-Emperor forsaken planet. And whilst their numbers had been much reduced, especially during the last two offensives, there was still more than enough of them left to form a hard centre to the newly arrived Chaos Hordes. And speaking of the Chaos Hordes, you may remember, I hope, I made a video a while ago in this series talking about how Vraks fell to chaos in the first place. I talked about how the Vraxians were subverted into a form of pseudo-worship of the ruinous powers. They were not necessarily willing traitors or chaos heretics. They had been tricked into their current predicament by their quote-unquote betters. But whilst this pseudo-worship of the ruinous powers, by utilising their iconography and some prayers perhaps, were relatively widespread, this does not mean that the population by and large were out-and-out worshippers of said ruinous powers. They were most definitively no longer innocent, shall we say, their use of chaos iconography having already stained their souls irreversibly black, but there is an important distinction to be made between a person who has been tricked into worshipping something and someone that is a genuine, raving, crazed fanatic of the ruinous powers. And with the arrival of 500,000 of said crazed fanatics, along with their preachers, their war leaders, and of course the Chaos Astartes themselves, the nature of chaotic worship on Vraks was about to change dramatically. For the way that we know chaos works is that any and all concessions to it feeds its power, allows it to grow, but small concessions such as unwilling worshippers and the scrawling of various blasphemous icons on walls and helmets is only piddling worship. It is unlikely to draw the attention of any truly corrupting entity of the warp. The arrival of 500,000 true believers, on the other hand, oh yes, that is something quite different indeed. Very soon thereafter, full-blown blasphemous rituals were taking place all across the Vraxian-held territories. Chaos preachers were roaming the streets, shouting out the true litanies of their blasphemous gods to anyone willing to listen, and many who were not willing as well. The rate at which the chaos corruption spread, and its potency, was magnified many-fold by these new arrivals, and meant that what was once previously misled but well-meaning imperial citizens were quickly turned into raving lunatics themselves. Because, of course, chaos is not merely an idea. It is not a thought. It is not a philosophy. It is not a religion. It is a sickness of the soul, and it spreads as one. And on a planet like Vraks, where millions of souls were cooped up in tight, closely confined living quarters in the handful of remaining city hab blocks that had not yet been leveled by the Death Corps, the sickness spread with the speed of a wildfire. Very soon, the initial 500,000 lost and the damned would have become 1 million. Then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, until the entire population of Vraks had been turned into yet more willing worshippers of the ruinous powers. And then, at the very end, we have one last little bit of reinforcements that arrived along with the Chaos Flotilla, or, well, actually it arrived ahead of the Chaos Flotilla, inside of the Aron's Bane, the first Chaos craft to, so personally, make contact with Vraks and disgorge its reinforcements, in a somewhat unorthodox fashion, granted, yes, but, well, they got onto the surface with only a few thousand casualties, so who really cares? And besides, these last few reinforcements were not particularly great in number. A couple dozen maybe at absolute most. And whilst a few of them undoubtedly perished as the Aron's Bane fell from the void and onto the planet below, many of them did survive, and those who were too crippled to make their way out of the broken husk of the heavy transport were swiftly cannibalized for parts by those strong enough to take them. And speaking of getting out of the Aron's Bane, the hordes of Chaos cultists were already streaming out of the wrecked starship, but these last reinforcements were never meant to exit the Aron's Bane in quite such an improvised fashion, and it took quite a while for them to fashion their own exits out of the broken spacecraft. Fortunately, these last reinforcements were neither low on firepower or overburdened by moral scruples, and so could simply blast their way through the meter-thick hull of the Aron's Bane, and then they could take their first steps out onto the surface of Vraks, where undoubtedly the very first things they saw were the scattered corpses of the lost and the damned, who were not quite quick enough to get out of the way when they made their exit from the Aron's Bane. And with war horns blaring, the Titans of Legion of Volcanum began to march on the Death Corps siege lines. The introduction of air power had already radically changed the nature of war on Vraks, but these new arrivals had ambitions far beyond merely changing it. They had come to end it. Even just a single Titan could easily be considered the equivalent of an entire armed regiment, and along with the rest of the Chaos reinforcements, there had come an entire legion of these incredible engines of destruction. We do not know for sure the precise strength of Legion of Volcanum at the time of the Vraxian War, but we do know that they possessed both Warhound Titans and Ravagers, with the latter being the equivalent of an Imperial Reaver-class Titan. And against these monstrosities, even a super-heavy tank is little more than a mild annoyance. And the Death Corps of Krieg had little in the way of anti-Titan weaponry. They themselves had not received the assistance of the Legio Titanicus. The legions deemed that mere siege warfare was far beneath their talent. Surely, they reasoned, the mighty god machines of the Emperor could be put to better use in swifter, more decisive, and important campaigns than some slow, grinding war of attrition on a dirtball in the Skaras sector that no true gentleman had ever even heard of. But if the situation on Vraks was to be salvaged, that attitude would have to change rather quickly. For the time being, however, the Death Corps would have to deal with the Chaos Titans with whatever was at hand. A not insignificant task. Fortunately, the paranoia of the Death Corps had once again served them well, and they had brought along with them several super-heavy tanks. Originally, these massive vehicles were intended to be the spear tip of any armoured breakthrough, or potentially be used to destroy particularly stubborn enemy positions that the guns of the 88th Siege Army's artillery park just couldn't quite seem to get a hold of. By themselves, these super-heavy tanks are more than a match for virtually any other armoured vehicle on the battlefield, and a Baneblade tank is expected to simply shrug off most incoming anti-tank ammunition whilst being able to instantaneously annihilate virtually any armoured vehicle set up against it. A Titan, however, is an entirely different beast. Titans eat super-heavy tanks for breakfast, and whilst something like a Baneblade could certainly present a danger to a Warhound Titan, which, by the way, would be the lightest of the Chaos Titans, it would be no more than a potential danger, as the Titan's Void Shield generators would remain proof against any but the most concentrated barrage of Baneblade fire. But there was one vehicle, one super-heavy tank that the Death Corps had brought along for no particular reason other than a just-in-case scenario that could prove to be dangerous to even a Reaver-class Titan. And that, of course, was the mighty Shadow Sword. Armed with the Mark IV Phaeton-pattern volcano cannon, it would be able to deal with even the heaviest enemy armor, including Titans. Now, such a weapon had been considered superfluous to requirement for a mere siege, but the Death Corps had insisted on bringing along a few small formations of Shadow Swords, again, just in case. But to be clear, a Shadow Sword in and of itself is not a flawless answer to enemy Titans. And whilst the mere rumour of the presence of a Shadow Sword will certainly make any potential Titan Principe tread extra carefully, Shadow Swords should only be deployed as part of a combined arms formation, for whilst the Volcano Cannon is an incredibly powerful weapon able to turn solid rock into molten magma, a Titan's Void Shield is more than capable of defending against a single Volcano Cannon strike. And as you can probably imagine, a weapon of such destructive potency is somewhat slow on the reload. Thusly, to ensure a Shadow Sword's ability to kill an enemy Titan, its Void Shields must first be brought down. In an ideal situation, an entire squadron of Shadow Swords consisting of 3 of these behemoths will be emplaced in prepared and concealed positions in the path of incoming enemy Titans. From these prepared positions, the Shadow Swords will be able to gain a solid lock on incoming enemy god machines without themselves being detected. Then, the volcano cannons will be fired in a ripple, the first strike knocking out the enemy Titan's void shield, the second taking out any overlapping void shields as the larger god machines can have several of these infernal devices, and the third carrying out the kill shot, preferably targeting a Titan's cockpit, its primary plasma signature, or its means of locomotion. In less ideal scenarios, a squadron or two of other super heavy tanks, like for example the Baneblade, can be used to bombard down an enemy Titan's void shields, utilizing their massive guns and firing repeated salvos to knock out the enemy Titan's defenses. If super heavy tanks are in short supplies, then several squadrons or lighter vehicles like Leman Russ or preferably Vanquisher variants could also potentially be used, where the lighter vehicles will seek to simply overwhelm the Titan's void shields through sheer weight of firepower. Although, in such circumstances, losses amongst the armoured regiments should be expected to be considerable at best and crippling at worst. The Death Corps had, in other words, at the very least, the potential to deal with enemy Titans. Possibly. Hopefully. But whether or not they would be successful, well, you're going to have to wait until the next episode to find out. So, now you have a better idea of the scale and just how frightening these reinforcements really were, and how massively they were going to affect the balance of the war on Vraks. As always, if you liked the video, please do consider sharing it around to friends and interested parties. And until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.